He spent 3 days in solitary confinement in the maximum security wing of a Utah County jail, not for a crime, but for trucks he built nearly a decade before anyone knew his name. That man is David Sparks, better known to millions as Heavy D, and alongside his closest friend David Kiley, Diesel Dave, he turned diesel engines, a beat-up shop in Woods Cross, Utah, and raw YouTube videos into one of Discovery Channel's most watched unscripted shows in television history. What happened to both of them after the cameras stopped rolling is the part of their story that almost nobody has ever told in full. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly how a church parking lot conversation became a $100 million brand, and why, after everything they built together, neither man is where anyone expected them to be. They weren't brothers. They weren't even related. Despite the name printed on every truck, every piece of merchandise, and every episode of their Discovery Channel show, Heavy D and Diesel Dave shared no blood. What they shared was something harder to manufacture: a church singles activity in northern Utah, and a diesel truck sitting in the parking lot. David William Sparks was born on January 5, 1985, in Utah. He grew up obsessed with vehicles, not as a hobby, but as an identity. Auto mechanics was one of his favorite subjects in high school. He enrolled at Weber State University and withdrew before finishing, choosing the road instead of the classroom. Before he was ever on television, he served an LDS mission in Bolivia and Brazil, and came back fluent in Spanish and Portuguese. That detail matters, not because of the languages, but because of what it says about who he is. Heavy D does not do things halfway. When he commits, he goes all in. That quality would define everything that came after, the good and the bad. He launched his career splitting time between two occupations, working as director of marketing for a Utah-based watch company called Rockwell Watches, and operating heavy machinery for his uncle's construction business. He eventually started his own excavation company. He wasn't chasing fame, he was just building things. David Kiley was born on June 17, 1974, almost 10 years older than Sparks. He was born in Texas, moved around constantly as a kid because his father worked on military bases, and eventually settled north of Salt Lake City. Like Sparks, he served an LDS mission. Unlike Sparks, the years that followed were directionless. Driving trucks, installing siding on military contracts, taking whatever work came along. He had no plan. He had skill and hustle, but no destination. When his brother called him back to Utah to come work again, Kiley showed up. And not long after, at a church singles function, he met Heavy D. They talked. Heavy D had a diesel truck in the lot. He offered Kiley a ride. During that drive, something locked into place. Two men from the same world, speaking the same language, who happened to meet at exactly the right moment. They started calling each other brother. Not for the cameras, before the cameras even existed. But here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. Heavy D didn't set out to build a brand. He set out to build trucks. He hired Diesel Dave to help with equipment operations at his company. Together they started customizing diesel vehicles, filming what they were doing, and posting those videos online. The videos were raw, they were loud, they were covered in grease and exhaust smoke and genuine enthusiasm. And people found them, not because of an algorithm, not because of a marketing strategy, but because authenticity at that level is rare, and viewers can feel it. Heavy D brought the engineering ambition and the big picture thinking. Diesel Dave brought the warmth, the humor, the everyman quality that made two guys in a Utah shop feel like people you'd actually want to spend time with. Their dynamic was specific and real. One man who never stopped dreaming bigger. Another man who made you feel like you were already exactly where you needed to be. Together they were something neither of them was alone. Then Jay Leno watched one of those YouTube videos. Leno was a car enthusiast long before he was a late-night television legend, and what he saw in the Diesel Brothers content was the same thing their audience had already found: two guys who were genuinely good at something, with no pretense attached. He brought them onto his show. That appearance changed their trajectory overnight. Discovery Channel called shortly after. On January 4, 2016, Diesel Brothers premiered on cable television, and the audience that had been watching their YouTube videos followed them onto the small screen in massive numbers. The show ran for 8 full seasons. Heavy D's personal YouTube channel, Heavy D Sparks, would eventually climb to 4.59 million subscribers and accumulate over 1.16 billion total views. They wrote a book together. They co-piloted Brodozer and Bro Camino in Monster Jam competitions. They collaborated with Marshawn Lynch, hung out with major celebrities, and turned their shop into a nationally recognized brand. At the peak of it, Diesel Brothers was not just a television show. It was a culture. For 5 or 6 years, everything worked. The brand worked. The partnership worked. The audience believed in them, and they believed in each other. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. In 2016, while Diesel Brothers was riding high in its first season, a Utah-based nonprofit organization quietly purchased one of their trucks. The organization was called Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. They were not a government agency. They were not the EPA. They were a private nonprofit with no paid attorneys of their own, a small volunteer organization that had become concerned about air quality along Utah's Wasatch Front. And they had a legal mechanism available to them called a citizen suit provision, written into the Federal Clean Air Act, that allowed private groups to sue on behalf of the public interest when they believed federal environmental law was being broken. They bought a truck from Sparks Motors. They sent it to a testing lab in Denver, Colorado. What came back from that lab was damning. The truck had been modified with a straight pipe that allowed it to blast visible black exhaust smoke, a practice known as rolling coal. The emissions testing showed the truck was producing 36 times the legal pollutant limit and 21 times more particulate matter than it would have generated with an intact emissions system. The lawsuit was filed in 2017. It named Sparks, his business entities, and several co-defendants, alleging repeated and ongoing violations of the Clean Air Act through the practice of removing or tampering with factory emissions controls on diesel trucks, then selling those trucks or promoting the modifications publicly on YouTube, where the videos racked up millions of views. In March 2020, federal judge Robert Shelby ruled against Sparks and 3 co-defendants. The total penalty came to just over $851,000, split between payments to the federal government and Davis County. Beyond the financial penalty, the ruling included a permanent ban on performing or advertising emissions tampering on vehicles going forward. Here is the part most coverage of this story leaves out. Sparks appealed the ruling to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. The appeals court actually agreed with him on a significant portion of the case, ruling that liability could only apply to vehicles used within Utah, which eliminated the majority of the original claims. The penalty was cut substantially, down to roughly $550,000 in adjusted federal fines. He had won a meaningful chunk of the appeal, but winning most of the appeal did not end the financial bleeding. Under the citizen suit provision in the Clean Air Act, if a plaintiff wins any portion of a case, even a small fraction, they can demand reimbursement of 100% of their attorney's fees. UPE had lost 99% of their original claims. They were still entitled to full legal fee reimbursement, and over the years, 4 separate law firms had billed hours against Sparks. The total docket eventually reached 522 court filings, a number Heavy D described as the largest his own attorneys had ever seen in a single case. He had won the argument on appeal. He was still losing the war on paper. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around him saw coming. Heavy D didn't pay. There is a version of this decision that looks reckless. There is another version that looks principled. What Heavy D has said publicly is that he viewed the continuing legal fee demands as a system working against the outcome the courts had actually delivered. He had won on appeal. The penalty had been substantially reduced, and yet the ongoing legal billing had turned the case into something that felt, in his own words, like a blank check, with no ceiling and no end. His attorney stated clearly after the eventual arrest that no crime had been charged or alleged. This was a civil matter, but civil contempt has teeth. When court orders are repeatedly ignored, federal judges have the authority to compel compliance, and the ultimate tool for compelling compliance is incarceration. While the legal situation quietly deepened, the show came to an end. Both Heavy D and Diesel Dave stated publicly that the decision to walk away from Diesel Brothers was their own, that network television had become constraining, that the rigid schedules and corporate oversight no longer aligned with what they wanted their work to be. They were not pushed out. They walked out. But the end of the show removed the one thing that had kept both men pointed in the same direction. The shared project was gone, and without it, the differences that their chemistry had always smoothed over began to surface. Heavy D leaned hard into large-scale entrepreneurial ambition. Diesel Dave moved toward brand ambassador roles, Monster Jam appearances, and a quieter life in Utah with his wife Susan and their 3 children. 2 men who had called each other brother every day for nearly a decade were now simply 2 people building different things. Then, in 2023, Heavy D's father died. David Sparks Sr. was gone. It was a loss that arrived in the middle of an already brutal stretch, A lawsuit consuming years and money. A friendship quietly fading. A television era closed. Grief has a way of clarifying what is actually left. And what Heavy D saw when he looked around was a legal battle he still hadn't resolved, and a life that was changing faster than he had planned for. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. While the emissions lawsuit crawled through its 5th and 6th year in federal court, Heavy D opened a second front, in a completely different industry. He had spent years working alongside Nikola Corporation, the hydrogen and electric trucking company, as a brand ambassador and collaborator. Nikola had built significant hype around a consumer pickup truck called the Badger, a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle with serious performance specs. Then Nikola's founder, Trevor Milton, was investigated for fraud, convicted, and sentenced to federal prison. The company unraveled. The Badger project was canceled. Heavy D didn't walk away from the wreckage. He moved in. In February 2024, his newly formed company, EMBR Motors, co-founded with his attorney Cole Cannon, purchased the intellectual property and all physical assets associated with the Nikola Badger program. That acquisition included the only 2 working Badger prototypes ever built, along with Nikola's abandoned off-road and personal watercraft vehicle programs. The man whose career had been built on diesel engines that pushed out black smoke was now the owner of an electric and hydrogen vehicle program. The acquisition arrived at a complicated moment. Trevor Milton, despite being a convicted felon, had been attempting to influence Nikola's direction from outside the company, including pushing for board changes that would have installed allies, including Heavy D, in leadership positions. That effort failed, and Nikola then turned around and filed a lawsuit against EMBR Motors, Heavy D, and Cole Cannon in March 2024, alleging they had breached an agreement that was supposed to ensure Milton had no involvement in the new company. Heavy D was now actively defending 2 separate federal-level legal matters simultaneously: the decade-long emissions case from UPay, the breach of agreement suit from Nikola. Both expensive, both demanding, both requiring lawyers, court filings, and attention at a moment when his personal life was already absorbing more than it could hold. He kept working, he kept building, he kept posting, and then the federal marshals knocked on his door. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. On the morning of October 7, 2025, U.S. Marshals arrived at Heavy D Sparks' Utah location and placed him under arrest. The charge was civil contempt of court. The warrant had been signed 5 days earlier, on October 2nd, by the same federal judge who had presided over the original emissions case. The amount at the center of the contempt order, $843,602.23, still owed to Utah physicians for a healthy environment as a result of the 2021 ruling. This was not the first contempt finding. Heavy D had been found in contempt on June 24, 2024. A second contempt order came on August 4, 2025, after a judge determined he had transferred property in violation of the first contempt ruling, specifically the proceeds from a garage sale at Sparks Motors that a judge had previously ordered to be deposited into a court-controlled account. When those funds were not delivered as ordered, the arrest warrant followed. Heavy D later described what happened next in detail. He said he had been preparing to board a jet that morning to travel for a speaking engagement on behalf of the state of Utah when the marshals arrived. He was taken to the Salt Lake County Jail and placed in solitary confinement in the maximum security wing. He described spending approximately 2.5 days in isolation over what he characterized as a paperwork dispute in a civil lawsuit, not a criminal matter, not a violent offense, not a threat to anyone. He was released after agreeing, in a court hearing, to provide the plaintiffs with missing financial documents within 10 days. His contempt was ultimately purged by the court after those documents were delivered. His attorney stated publicly that no crime had ever been charged or alleged, and that the arrest had been a grave injustice to the Sparks family. Within days of his release, Heavy D posted a 30-minute video to his YouTube channel titled, "The Truth Behind Why I Was Thrown in Jail." He walked through the entire 9-year history, the original lawsuit, the appeal, the fee structure, the contempt findings, the arrest, in granular detail. He described it as bureaucracy run wild. He described a legal system that had punished small businesses rather than protected the environment. His supporters pointed to the 10th Circuit ruling as evidence that the original case had been overreached. His critics pointed to the court record, a judge who had issued the same orders multiple times across multiple years before finally signing an arrest warrant. Both things were true. He had won significant ground on appeal. He had also ignored court orders for years. The story is not simple, and the people who are most certain about which side is right are usually the ones who have read the least of it. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got. Until now. The arrest was not the only loss that autumn. 5 months after Heavy D walked out of the Salt Lake County Jail, his wife filed for divorce. Ashley Sparks filed the paperwork in a Utah court on March 10, 2026. No reason for the filing was listed in the documents. She and David had met at a church singles activity in Utah in 2008, the same kind of event where, years earlier, Heavy D had first met Diesel Dave. They married in August 2010. Together they had built a family of 5, daughter Charlie Mae, and sons Bo and Mac. In August 2021, on their 11th anniversary, Ashley had spoken warmly and publicly about their marriage. That was before the contempt orders, before the arrest, before the solitary confinement, before the second lawsuit, before the garage sale dispute, before years of legal fees consumed the financial foundation of the businesses they had built together. There is no confirmed explanation for the divorce filing, no statement from either party explaining why. The timing is the only context that exists, and timing, in a story like this one, speaks for itself. Meanwhile, the friendship between Heavy D and Diesel Dave had not ended with a fight or a dramatic falling out. There was no single moment that broke it. Both men have spoken publicly about the partnership in terms that are honest rather than bitter, acknowledging that people grow in different directions, that shared ambition can only hold 2 people together for so long when the project that focused that ambition no longer exists. Heavy D described grief about the end of their era. He described acceptance. What he stopped short of was pretending it hadn't happened. The bond that had launched a YouTube channel, landed them on Jay Leno's stage, and filled 8 seasons of television, was no longer what it had been. That is not nothing. That is the kind of loss that doesn't show up in a court filing or a press release. It just becomes visible, slowly, in the things that stop being made together. One phone call, one conversation, that's all it took to change the direction of everything. By early 2026, something shifted. Both men announced they were building a new Brodozer monster truck, a successor to the vehicle that had defined some of their best years together, now fitted with a Cat C13 engine and built with a tighter, smaller wheelbase than the original. 2 men who had quietly drifted, were at least in the context of a shop and a build, working together again. It is worth being honest about what that means and what it doesn't. Rebuilding a truck is not the same as rebuilding a friendship. Sharing a project again is not the same as erasing the cost of the years that passed between them. But for 2 men whose entire partnership was forged by getting their hands dirty over diesel engines and pointing a camera at the result, it is not nothing either. They started in a shop. If there is any language both of them speak fluently, it is this one. Heavy D's EMBR Motors holds the intellectual property and both physical prototypes of the Nikola Badger. The Nikola lawsuit continues. The divorce proceedings are underway. The emissions case, the one that started all of this, has been grinding through courts for nearly a decade and still isn't fully resolved. His YouTube channel sits at 4.59 million subscribers and over 1.16 billion total views. The audience never left. They watched the arrest videos. They watched the 30-minute explanation. They watched the response from the environmental group. They are watching now. Whatever Heavy D builds next, he will not be building it in obscurity. Diesel Dave, for his part, has lived a quieter chapter. He continues his Monster Jam appearances, his brand partnerships, and his life in Utah with Susan and their 3 children. He stepped out of the chaos and stayed out. He built a steadier life on the same foundation: trucks, faith, family, without the friction. Whether that was wisdom or simply a different kind of ambition is the kind of question that doesn't have an answer from the outside. 2 men, same shop where it all started. 2 entirely different versions of where the road led. The story of Heavy D and Diesel Dave is not really about trucks, or television, or even a federal lawsuit. It is about what happens when the shared project that held 2 people together ends, and what each of them does in the silence that follows. Heavy D Sparks is 41 years old. He has over 1 billion views, a failed hydrogen truck company he turned into his own venture, an active divorce, 2 separate legal battles still in motion, and a new monster truck build taking shape in a Utah garage. Whatever comes next will not be quiet. It never has been. Diesel Dave built something different, steadier, smaller, and still standing. In 2026, they are in the shop again, building together. Whether the friendship that once defined both of them is truly coming back, or whether this is just 2 professionals who still share a language, Only they know the answer to that. What Heavy D chose, to fight the lawsuit for a decade rather than pay and move on, cost him more than money. It cost him the life he had built around that shop in Woods Cross. Some people will say the fight was worth it. Others will say the cost was everything. Would you have paid the $843,000 and moved on? Or would you have fought the way Heavy D did, even knowing where it ended up? Let me know below.